Hello, friends! This week's case has to do with a disturbed family member who had a 20-year grudge on his family and decided to do something about it. So, let's get started. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. For those that are new here, my name is Brandy, and every Friday I bring you a true crime case or mystery with one or more of my fabulous felines. For my returning subscribers, welcome back, my feline friends, and a big shout out to my feline fans who help support this channel. Just a reminder that a Black Friday sale is going on in my merch store, so don't miss out. Link is in the description below. So, this week's case has to do with Paul Merhige, and he was born in 1974 in Florida to a pretty upscale family. Now, he was the second child to Carol and Michael Merhige. He had an older brother, and then later he would have two younger twin sisters. Now, Paul was a varsity athlete and excelled in pretty much everything he did. He played football, soccer, and baseball, and he was an honors student. Paul was driven, handsome, personable, but he was a little quiet. Now, Paul was well liked by everyone, but wasn't considered popular because he was so quiet and kept to himself. Paul graduated high school third in his class, and he went on to attend the University of Miami with plans to become a doctor. So he sounds like a great guy, right? But cracks started showing, and the first real problem started when he was 13 years old. The family was just talking one night and kind of got into a debate, like a minor argument about something. And Paul, he had gotten very angry, and the family felt he actually overreacted to the situation. He ended up pulling out a loaded pistol, and he pointed it at the family, threatening to shoot them. Now, luckily, Paul never pulled the trigger, and the family was able to get the gun away from him, and to this day, nobody knows where he got that gun. So they got Paul some help, and it was determined that Paul suffered from some depression, and he also had obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. Paul started losing his hair around 17 years old, and he was actually taking Rogaine to kind of try to keep it. And it was due to kind of his mental illnesses, all, depression, anxiety, the OCD. And then he started suffering insomnia on top of all of this. Now, at age 19, Paul was in college, and he ended up just having a complete nervous breakdown. Being OCD, Paul was a huge germaphobe. He would take several showers a day, and long showers, and he always wore 2 pairs of underwear. He refused to wear shorts ever because his legs were then, out in the elements and could get dirty. Now, another symptom of OCD is constantly revisiting a situation that happened in the past. And it could be, just like a couple days ago, but it could be years ago as well. Paul thought that his family, was either ignoring him or they had insulted him at one point in his life. And he just revisit that event over and over in his head, where he was just anxiety analyzing it, just picking it apart. He wouldn't let it go. And there was times that, things would happen years ago, and he would just keep bringing it up and stewing over it. Now, some of these events, or these debates or minor arguments that he got into about his family were usually over religion. See, Paul, he didn't believe that even if you were a religious person, that you believed every single word in the Bible. And if somebody said they did, he would debate them on it. And of course, as you can imagine, these would become some pretty intense debates. So all of this came to a head when he was 19 years old. The stress of college, the stress of not living with your parents, the stress of he couldn't keep a job because his OCD and his mental issues. and he ended up allegedly attempting suicide. Now, that attempt failed, and he started seeing a psychiatrist regularly. And the things he told his psychiatrist were things like that he could not stop thinking about death, and that he was kind of jealous of his sisters because they didn't have the problems he had. Then this jealousy kind of escalated, and he started attacking his sisters. He started threatening to kill them. He didn't like that they didn't, have the same problems as he did, and that they were enjoying life. And his one twin sister actually had gotten married, and, she was happy. So in 1998, when Paul was 24 years old, he took out a restraining order on his one sister, Carla, and he had claimed that she tried to kill him. However, a few weeks later, he dropped the restraining order. Then, in 2006, Carla took out a restraining order on Paul, stating that Paul was trying to kill her and threatened to kill her and then kill himself. Now, again, a few weeks later, that protective order was dropped as well. Now, Paul's other twin sister named Lisa, she was the one that had gotten married, and she got married to a man named Patrick, who was a pretty successful lawyer. Now, Patrick was not a big fan of Paul. He looked at Paul like he was a lazy failure who never tried. And he was not a functioning member of society and lived off of his parents' support that they gave him. Now, I'm not sure about, Patrick's feelings towards Paul, but Paul did live off of his parents. His parents financially supported him for years due to him not being able to keep a job. So cut to 2009, and it is Thanksgiving Day. Jim and Muriel, who is actually Paul's aunt and uncle, had agreed to host Thanksgiving for the family. They had a 6-year-old daughter named Michaela who loved to sing and dance, and she had written all these cards on what she was thankful for and displayed them for all the family to see. A lot of people attended this Thanksgiving, both family and friends, but mainly it was Jim and Muriel who owned the house, Carol and Michael, Paul's parents, Paul's twin sisters, Carla and Lisa, which included Lisa's husband, Patrick, and at the time, Lisa had just found out she was pregnant with her first child. Also in attendance were Paul's other aunt and uncle, and a few extended family and friends. All in all, there was about 16 people attending this Thanksgiving dinner. Now, by this time in 2009, Paul was 35 years old, and he had pretty much become estranged from most of the family because of various issues, with the exception of his parents. Now, Jim and Muriel, his aunt and uncle who were hosting the Thanksgiving dinner, had not seen Paul in over 13 years. So they didn't invite him because he never came to these events anyway. However, this year, a couple days before Thanksgiving, Paul kept calling his mother and kept telling her that he would like to come to Thanksgiving and was asking what time it started, how long it'll last, what time it'll end, where it's being held. Like, he just wanted all these details. So Carol told him all the details, and Thanksgiving Day arrived. Everyone starts showing up to Jim and Muriel's place. Michaela is singing and dancing for everyone, and Paul's not there yet. Now, Carol, Paul's mother, she doesn't mention to Muriel that Paul was planning on coming. She just kind of kept it quiet. Plus, Paul was late, and so she figured that he probably wasn't going to come anyway. But she did have a conversation with her daughter, Lisa, and she had stated that she had a bad feeling, that he was just kind of being weird because he kept calling over and over, asking the time and directions and all of that stuff. And she actually said to her daughter, Lisa, "I hope he doesn't come kill us all tonight." Now, Lisa actually agreed with her mother. And she's like, I know, I just have a bad feeling too. She goes, but don't tell Dad we're talking this way because Dad will get upset that we're having these thoughts. So the family just kept it quiet until Paul called his dad's cell phone and was asking for directions. And that's when the family found out that Paul was coming. Now, Jim and Muriel didn't really think much of it, was a little surprised, but gave him directions anyway. And Paul showed up an hour and a half late. Although a little hesitant, they still welcomed Paul in, made a place at the table for him, and everything seemed to go okay. Now, Paul would attend the dinner and he would eat, but he wouldn't really say anything to anybody. Then after dinner, there was various games and singing and watching Michaela dance. And again, Paul just kind of sat on the sidelines and didn't say much, nor was he participating in anything. So 3 hours go by since Paul's arrival, and everybody's just kind of having some fun. And Paul gets up from where he was sitting, and he just quietly walks out the door. And they notice, but they figure maybe he's going to smoke or something, right? Like, whatever, just need some fresh air. About 20 minutes later, Paul comes back inside the home, and he's standing by the refrigerator looking out over the family. Family members stated that they noticed that he was just staring and he had this evil, haunting look on his face. And then they looked down and realized he was holding a rifle. He was holding a Remington 700, a bolt action rifle, and then he just started shooting. His twin sisters, Carla and Lisa, were the first to be shot, and they died of their injuries. Patrick, Lisa's husband, was shot in the stomach, but he was able to stay conscious, and unfortunately all he could do is sit back and witness the rest of Paul's rampage. Paul ended up shooting his aunt in the shoulder, and when his uncle came to her aid, he would put the gun to her chest and unfortunately finish her off. He then pointed the gun at his uncle and pulled the trigger twice, but the gun had jammed. Paul then worked at getting the gun unjammed, and as he was reloading the gun, he stated to his father, "I've been waiting 20 years to do this." Now, this started happening later at night. 6-year-old Michaela had been put to bed for the night, so she actually wasn't out in the main part of the house when this was happening. And most of the family members were running for their lives or hiding, trying to get away from Paul. And unfortunately, Paul remembered Michaela and then went and visited her room. He would unfortunately end up shooting her 3 times. Paul then walked out of the home calmly, got in his car, and left. Now, calls began pouring into 911 because this was an upper scale neighborhood, and neighbors heard gunshots and called the police right away. Authorities arrived on the scene, and out of the 16 people who attended this Thanksgiving dinner, 4 family members were beyond help. Paul's twin sisters, Carla and Lisa, including Lisa's unborn child, Paul's aunt, and little Michaela. There were other family members that had injuries. A family friend named Clifford had been grazed in the shoulder. Patrick, Lisa's husband, had been shot in the stomach, and he was in critical condition. However, he was taken to the hospital where they put him in a medically induced coma, and he was like that for several months. The Red Cross team came onto the scene and gathered the surviving family members up to place them into safety since Paul was at large. Now, oddly enough, this isn't the first time that this family had this type of tragedy. Back in 1973, a year before Paul was born, Paul's dad, Michael, had a sister named Salwa, and Salwa killed her ex-husband and her children. Apparently, the story goes that Salwa was an opera singer, and she had given up her future because she met her husband and married him and wanted a family. Salwa and her husband were married for 19 years, and they had 2 children together. Then, Salwa's husband left her for another woman. After the divorce, Salwa's ex-husband had come over to pick up the children for a visitation, and Salwa had asked her ex-husband to come inside the house. Now, the two children are actually out in the ex-husband's car waiting for him. When the ex-husband walked into the house, Salwa shot him with a pistol. She then asked her children to come in one at a time, and when they came in the house, she shot them as well. Now, Salwa did not end up shooting herself. What she did is she took a handful of pills, barbiturates, and tried to commit suicide that way. That would put her into a coma, and then she would die at the hospital days later. Just tragic. So Paul is on the run. Nobody knows where he's at. They only know the car that he's driving. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and a manhunt began. Now, they searched for weeks, and they could not find him. Authorities then brought in the FBI to help with the search. Meanwhile, other detectives started putting together information and investigating what Paul did. So, a security tape was discovered the day before Thanksgiving where Paul was visiting a gun shop. Paul was chatting up with the gun shop clerk, and they were talking about a scope that he was putting on the rifle that he was buying. They also discovered that Paul had gone to 2 other gun shops to buy ammunition and various supplies. Paul had also packed a bag with some of his clothes and belongings and medications that he was on, and he withdrew $12,000 from his parents' bank account the day before. Now, Paul had been on the run for 5 weeks. Authorities figured he could be anywhere at this point, right? However, a U.S. Marshal who was good at profiling didn't think that Paul actually went far. You see, he said Paul had been, supported and spoon-fed by his parents his entire life. And he couldn't keep a job due to his mental health issues. And he really didn't have any place to go because at this point no family members were going to hide him. And because of his OCD, he's not going to go anywhere too unfamiliar to him because he wouldn't be able to handle it. So in January, the TV show America's Most Wanted did a segment on Paul, and he was considered one of the top 10 most wanted fugitives at the time. Then a reward of $100,000 was put on the table for information leading to Paul's arrest. Now, shortly after the broadcast of America's Most Wanted, a motel owner who watched that TV show noticed that this Paul on the segment looked an awful lot like the guy who was renting a room. However, this guy that was renting the room, his name, or supposed name, was John Boca, and the license plate on the car that he was driving didn't match the license plate that they stated on the show, but the car make and model was the same. And John Boca had paid 2 weeks in advance for his room in cash. So the hotel owner decided to call the tip line. It wasn't even a day later. The FBI was there, evacuated the motel, and broke into John Boca's room. And it was actually Paul. Paul had actually barricaded himself in the room by putting a mattress in front of the door and then a metal bar. But that didn't stop the FBI. They broke it down. When they broke down the door, Paul was at a desk, working on this laptop, and he had stood up, put his hands up, and he had the gall to say, "Don't shoot me." And then he ran for the bathroom. Now, the FBI was able to get a hold of him, and they had to taser him 3 times to get him to be able to be handcuffed. So once he was in handcuffs and put in a squad car, they started searching the room. Paul apparently had some devices on the ready to commit suicide. There was a cord tied in a noose. There were 3 small helium tanks, a plastic hood, and a rubber hose. And he had purchased the book just a few days prior called Final Exit, The Practicalities, which is a how-to book to commit suicide. They also found 2 handguns and 5 different cell phones. He was talking on the cell phones, which made authorities think he had accomplices, but all the numbers belonged to people who didn't know Paul. So one guy was actually completely shocked to find out that his phone number was somehow attached to this prepaid cell phone, because he had had that number for over 12 years and he had no idea who Paul Merhige was. Paul had also shaved his head, which they thought was an attempt to maybe, be a little bit more inconspicuous, but obviously it didn't work. And then, of course, America's Most Wanted was told of, the raid, the arrest, and they were there to film this whole thing. You can see the clip online, but I'll play a small clip where they stuck a camera in Paul's face as he was being arrested, and this is what Paul said.
18 years of utter torment.
What do you mean by that?
I've had chronic medical problems, mental problems. It's been a nightmare. I didn't even know what I was doing.
Why have you been hiding out then?
I didn't even know what to do. I went several times to turn myself in. I was waiting for my parents to maybe make a statement and tell me to try. I didn't know what to do.
Once they got Paul to the station, they started interrogating him, which he didn't really have much to say, except, I don't know why I did it. When asked specifically why he killed Michaela, because, Michaela was only 6 years old, and this family hadn't seen Paul in over 13 years, so he never knew Michaela. So there was no reason for him to have, any animosity towards her, and he really didn't have much to say. But the family later stated that Michaela was kind of the center of attention at that Thanksgiving night, because she was singing and dancing and everybody was just kind of, fussing over her, and they felt that Paul got jealous of that. So Paul was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder. And they were pushing to give him the death penalty. Now, in Florida, they do have the death penalty, but it is not used hardly ever. And if they were successful at getting Paul the death penalty, he would be the first prisoner to be executed in over 20 years. Now, Paul's parents cut him off at this point. I mean, do you blame them? But they refused to get him an attorney. And because Paul didn't have any money, he was given a public defender. Paul's attorney thought about trying for the insanity defense plea, but that was going to be really hard because of all the planning that Paul did up to the murders. So it's not like he just snapped. He was planning this for a while. In the end, Paul accepted a plea deal where he would be sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, and he had to waive all of his appeal rights. They would give him this in lieu of giving him the death penalty. Now, Jim, Paul's uncle and father to little Michaela, he was not happy about this plea deal at all. He showed up at court when he was holding a lock of Michaela's hair, and he begged and pleaded with the judge to not spare Paul's life, and that this last-minute plea deal was shoved down their throats, and he was not happy with it at all. However, because Jim was not happy at all about it, he filed a civil suit against Paul's parents, Carol and Michael, claiming that they had been negligent by not informing them that Paul was planning to visit that night until the last minute, and that Carol and Lisa both had this bad feeling about it and never told anybody. Overall, he stated that he felt Paul's parents had the ability to stop Paul, but didn't. Now, Patrick, Lisa's husband, after he woke up from the coma and recovered, he filed a similar suit as well over the death of his wife and unborn child. However, both suits ended up being rejected by the courts. Jim and Muriel, the parents to Michaela, they still live in the same house where this shooting happened. They stated that the house holds more happy memories than just what happened that night. They left Michaela's room untouched as a memorial to her, and they started a foundation in her name that supports music and arts, and they have an annual concert every year. Muriel became pregnant and she gave birth to another child at age 50. As for Paul's parents, Carol and Michael, I couldn't find much about them, so I just think they sort of, kept to themselves and wanted to disappear. The bad part about this case is not only losing your family members, but how the surviving family members, they're all torn apart. Lawsuits were filed, fingers were pointed, accusations were made. Those relationships are done. They're probably never ever going to be mended again. Could things have ended up differently if certain things were done? I mean, what if Carol and Michael told Jim and Muriel Paul was coming right away? Would they have still let him? Or what if Carol told Paul not to come to Thanksgiving, that it wasn't a good idea? Would he have came anyway? I mean, after all, he was planning all this ahead of time, and I don't think anything like directions would have stopped him. I would love to hear what you think in the comments down below. If you'd like to become a feline friend, hit that subscribe button, and if you would like to become a feline fan, hit that join button for special perks. Thanks everyone, have a great holiday, and I will see you next Friday. Bye!